I briefed Charles long before the crown allowed him to matter. To the public, he was known as the heir who waited, the man standing one step behind history while time passed visibly across his face. People spoke of impatience. They joked about delay. Some questioned whether he would ever truly step into the role prepared for him at birth. Inside the palace, none of those words were used. I was assigned to prepare briefing materials for him during years when authority belonged everywhere except his desk. Every document I carried into the room was carefully worded, not because the information was sensitive, but because the recipient was expected to absorb responsibility without exercising it. The first thing I learned was this: waiting was not a personal flaw. It was a condition imposed by design. On mornings when the schedule was heavy, I would arrive early, folders aligned, margins checked, language softened where conviction might appear too strong. Charles always arrived on time, not early, not late. He sat, listened, and never interrupted the flow of information. To the outside world, that silence appeared passive. Inside the room, it was discipline. There were occasions when he paused over a page longer than expected, his finger resting against a sentence that would never reach the final decision. He did not ask for changes. He asked for clarity, and even then, he asked quietly. The public believed Charles was waiting for the crown. What they never saw was that the crown was teaching him how to wait, not as preparation, but as endurance. When the doors closed, he was not rehearsing kingship. He was learning restraint as a permanent condition. That was the beginning of his real trial. The public believed Charles lacked decisiveness. They said he hesitated when others acted, that he spoke carefully because he was unsure, that sensitivity slowed him where firmness was required. Inside the palace, that interpretation never existed. What people mistook for hesitation was training. Every briefing followed an unspoken hierarchy. Information moved upward, decisions moved sideways, authority flowed elsewhere. Charles was expected to absorb everything without appearing to claim ownership of any of it. I remember a briefing early in my assignment that made this clear to me. The room was small. The windows faced inward toward the courtyard. The subject was environmental policy, an area he understood deeply and cared about openly. He listened without interruption. When the briefing concluded, there was a pause long enough to invite comment. He did not speak immediately, not because he had nothing to say, but because speaking first was never safe. When he finally responded, he framed his point as a question, not a directive, not even a recommendation. Just a question. It was acknowledged politely, noted, and quietly redirected to a later discussion that would not include him. Outside those walls, commentators would later describe him as cautious. Inside, we understood the truth. Caution was survival. Every idea introduced too firmly created discomfort. Every suggestion delivered with certainty implied impatience, and impatience from an heir was remembered. Charles learned early that visibility carried risk, not scandal, but memory. People forget silence. They do not forget initiative taken too soon. So he waited, not in inactivity, but in constant calibration. He learned how to speak without leaving a mark, how to care without appearing to claim, how to remain present while letting others conclude the room. From the outside, it looked like indecision. From the inside, it was the discipline of a man being shaped to endure an institution that outlasts personalities. The public asked why he did not assert himself. They never asked who would have allowed it. That was what they got wrong. In private, there were habits no one discussed, not because they were scandalous, but because they revealed the quiet cost of restraint. Charles was often described as formal, yet away from public settings, formality gave way to something far more controlled. There was a rhythm to his days that rarely changed. Briefings in the morning, engagements structured down to the minute, evenings reserved for reading and review. What struck me was not the volume of work, it was the absence of release. After particularly long days, when discussions circled familiar ground without resolution, he did not vent frustration. He did not criticize. He asked for clarification. Again. One evening stands out in my memory. We had just returned from a public engagement that required visible enthusiasm and restraint in equal measure. The applause had been generous, the coverage favorable. Inside the briefing room afterward, he removed his jacket slowly and sat without speaking. I began summarizing the next day's schedule. Halfway through, I realized he was not listening. His attention rested on a single document from earlier that day. The same document he had marked lightly in the margin with a pencil. Not changes, questions. He did not raise them. Instead, he asked me how long similar briefings had been postponed in the past. I answered carefully. He nodded once. That was the extent of it. Moments like these were never visible. They left no trace in speeches or photographs, but they revealed something essential. Restraint was no longer situational. It had become habitual. Over time, he learned to withdraw without retreating, to pause without disengaging, to maintain composure even when conviction had no outlet. Emotion was not absent. It was contained. In those private spaces, silence was not awkward. It was functional. And the longer this pattern continued, the clearer it became. He was not simply waiting for authority. He was being shaped by the absence of it. That side of Charles was never meant to be seen, because it contradicted the idea of waiting as inactivity. Waiting, in reality, was work. The palace did not resist Charles. It absorbed him. That distinction mattered. Control inside the system was never enforced through refusal. It arrived as guidance, as reassurance, as reminders delivered gently, often framed as protection. When Charles showed urgency, it was not corrected, it was redirected. When he expressed conviction, it was acknowledged, then postponed. The system did not say no, it said later. One incident clarified this dynamic more than any other. A briefing had been scheduled following a series of regional visits. The subject matter was familiar. The tone was expected to be procedural. Charles arrived with a revised outline he had prepared himself. It was measured, carefully phrased. Nothing in it challenged authority, but it suggested momentum. As I reviewed the document, I noticed the shift immediately. Not radical, just firmer. When the discussion began, the room changed. No objections were raised, no voices lifted. Instead, the outline was praised, commended for thoughtfulness, then set aside for further consultation. Consultation that did not include him. After the meeting, no one mentioned it again. Charles did not ask why. He had learned that questions about delay only extended it. The crown does not oppose initiative from an heir. It neutralizes it. The conflict was never personal, it was structural. The system was built to preserve continuity above momentum, and continuity required that no single individual appear indispensable, even one waiting to inherit the crown. Over time, Charles adjusted his approach again. He stopped presenting complete ideas. He introduced fragments. He learned to allow others to reach conclusions he had already considered, to let progress feel collective rather than directional. From the outside, this looked like accommodation. From the inside, it was survival within an institution that does not bend under pressure. The tension was not dramatic. There were no confrontations. But it accumulated. The longer waiting became routine, the more it shaped his sense of self. Authority, when it finally came, would not arrive as transformation. It would arrive as permission, long delayed. And that delay was not accidental. It was the system at work. There was one briefing I remember more clearly than any other, not because of what was said, but because of what everyone avoided saying. It was late in the afternoon. The building felt unusually still. Corridors that were normally active had grown quiet, as if the palace itself was holding its breath. The transition was not discussed openly. No timetable was confirmed. No language suggested proximity. Yet everyone in the room understood that time was no longer abstract. The documents that day were thinner than usual, condensed, carefully neutral. As I placed them on the table, Charles did not reach for them immediately. He looked instead at the empty chair opposite him. No one acknowledged it. When he finally opened the folder, he moved more slowly than normal, not hesitant, deliberate. He read every page. At the end, there was a pause, not the kind that invites comment, the kind that settles. I waited for instruction. None came. Instead, he asked a question that had nothing to do with the briefing. He asked whether future materials should continue to follow the same approval process. It was a simple question, procedural, almost administrative. The answer, delivered carefully, was yes, until further notice. He nodded once. That was all. No adjustment was requested, no clarification offered, no recognition of what everyone in the room already knew. Even then, the system held its shape. After the meeting, as we walked toward the corridor, no one spoke. Footsteps echoed more loudly than usual. At the doorway, Charles stopped briefly. He did not look back. He did not comment. But the pause lingered. It was the pause of someone standing at the edge of a threshold that could not yet be crossed. In that moment, waiting was no longer preparation. It was containment. The system had carried him this far, and it would carry him further still. Not by force, by procedure. History will remember King Charles III as the heir who waited longer than any before him. It will describe patience as virtue, endurance as preparation, restraint as maturity. Those of us who stood closest remember something less visible. Waiting did not harden him. It refined him to the point of narrowing. Years of absorbing responsibility without authority reshaped how he moved through rooms, how carefully he introduced ideas, how rarely he allowed urgency to surface. When authority finally arrived, it did not feel like a beginning. It felt like the removal of a weight that had been carried so long it no longer registered as burden. The crown endured, as it always does. But something human had been deferred. Not erased, not damaged. Deferred until habits formed in silence could not simply be set aside. Charles became king with experience no one could dispute, and with instincts shaped by postponement rather than command. The system gained what it values most: continuity. What it loses is harder to measure, because what is lost does not announce itself. It leaves no public record. It appears only in the careful spacing of words, in the preference for consultation over declaration. Waiting in the end was not the period before his reign, it was the condition that defined it. And that was the trial the public never saw.